Next up, I'd like to introduce Gary Ranker, renowned global CEO, coach, author, and advisor to our company. He'll be talking about global trends in coaching. Thank you, Gary.
First of all, I wanted to say thank you for inviting me, Alex. It's a pleasure to be on your advisory board. And also I want to say thanks to Rini Carew, who I've known over quite a long time, the program director, and also Denise Sinek. This, in some ways, I was sitting in the back of the room, and I was thinking about the times that I've been here at the coaching conference. And in some ways, it feels like a family. It's like sometimes you go to Thanksgiving and you're with extended family. And in some ways, this is like an extended family for me. I'm extremely involved and passionate about the work that I get to do. In fact, I feel really, really privileged. And as some of you know, who I've known for a little while, I've been coaching for quite a long time, since before the term coaching became widely known in the late 80s. And so this is sort of like coming home, except for the fact that I live here, and you all have come to my home. But thank you very much for letting me talk. I'm going to spend a little bit of time discussing some of the trends and some of the differences that I see in coaching between, let's say, what's happened in the past and what we're entering into now. And if I get started, the thing that I'm most passionate about and I'm known for is I call it global mindset. And this is a definition that I have: the ability to step outside your own culture. Now, when I think about the themes, I'd like to have you think that there are, let's say, 4 major takeaways that I'd like for you to think about from my presentation. And when I go through those, one of them is that coaching has become successful all over the world. Now, my own personal practice happens to be global. And so I'm seeing that. So in some ways, I have this kind of disparity going on inside myself, in that I've been around for a long time, and yet I'm also on the front lines. I'm in places where coaching is perhaps only 5 years old, some of the countries where I work. And so there's this kind of difference that I have of having seen it develop, and yet also see it actually developing right now. And so one of the first themes is the coaching is successful. In the beginning, when I first was doing this, let's say early 90s, I thought for a while that this was a passing fad. It was one of those buzzwords that perhaps had a life for a while, and then it would stop, and something else would emerge. And my own practice is not broadcast. It's quite narrow in terms of the focus of what I do and the few people I work with. But I would, every once in a while, look up and I would realize that this activity called coaching, which I started to hear that term around 1992, it actually was continuing to grow. And so what's happened, though, is that it has continued to spread. And as we'll talk, but one of the themes that I'd like for you to think about in terms of takeaways is that the profession is successful, and it has become something that's important worldwide in almost all nations. The second is that global mindset, I believe, and I'm going to advocate to you, is something that is very important as well. In other words, the ability to think beyond your own culture and to realize you are part of a profession that is, in fact, global. The third takeaway that I'd like you to think about is that disruption is occurring. There are disruptive technologies, and we'll talk a little bit about that in the brief time I have to talk. And the last is events. And again, I'll get to what I mean by that, but there are global events occurring, which I believe all of this has to do with coaches needing to think about context. So if I were to give you a kind of byline, instead of what I said, that I'm coming from the front lines of coaching, I'd say context. That's really what I'm talking about. The context is becoming more and more important. I happen to have, all my life I've been globally or internationally oriented. There's a little bit of background. Some of you already know these things. But coaching, as I've mentioned, it's worldwide. It has a valuable role, particularly historically, for building management skills. So we see it valued and needed. Its global mindset is not so much a nice to do in many parts of the world, but rather it's something that, as I will explain a little bit more, global mindset to me means understanding the cultures where you're coaching. Now, this begins to be one of the first things that I'd like to highlight. When I mentioned the global events, this is an example. In 2008, actually, I was at a conference board, coaching conference, exactly this conference. It happened to have been that year at the Harvard Club. And I was, even at that time, in the front line, out there in some other parts of the world. And I was beginning to see what in Japan was called the Lehman shock. Much of the rest of the world called it global financial crisis. And we had begun to see some moves towards something happening in our own American society that probably would become quite important. At that time, it was the first time that I talked in a coaching conference about, well, something very big. We're on the verge of something very large in terms of a social, economic event. And in fact, it did have a lot of impact on coaching, one of which was budgets, but also a rethink about where and when coaches would be needed. So that's actually is a picture of the Harvard Club, which is number 35 at 44th Street, right here in Manhattan. And the next of these takeaways that I'd like you to think about is about disruption that's occurring. In the recent years, we've begun to see new technologies. Uber is one of the most widely talked about examples. But here in this room, we've been seeing some of the other companies, and we've heard from, and we'll hear from more, companies that are also in their own right, similar to Uber. In fact, in some ways, CoachLogix, I believe, also is in that same area. We have disruption. And so, again, if I'm pleading with you, those of you who are purchasing coaching, those of you who are coaches, think about how important it is to think about context. Not just if a coach has the skills to help someone be a better manager, but that they are capable of understanding the context. Disruption, of course it creates opportunity, but it also brings uncertainty. And one of the things that is very difficult for businesses is if there is uncertainty. It makes it hard to plan. A couple of years ago, actually in 2015, I began some research because I have this unique opportunity of having worked with and have current clients in different countries. I chose to go out to those clients, and I surveyed about 100 CEOs who were in different parts of the globe. And what I was looking at is what was important to them in terms of the skills that they possessed, that they believed helped them to be, it's not just valued, but successful as global managers. And I asked them then, I went into discussion about how would you get those skills? And then, in terms of kind of a funnel effect, coaching is one of those ways that you could get global skills. So I was looking at global management and the way that coaching fits into training people or helping people to get better. Global mindset as an indication itself, this is the result. And you'll find, actually I have a book that is out on the table that has a lot of this detail in it that's available for you. But these are some of the things that I learned from this global research. Now, what kind of manager skills are necessary to be in a global situation? This is what I picked up from the 100 people. I also went out on the internet and talked and got information from a couple of thousand people in addition to the 100 that I interviewed in person. The next one is, well, going back here, to be a coach who's relevant. This is what these global managers said. This is what they're looking for in a coach to help them to be able to be more skilled, to be more effective globally as a manager. So these were the qualities that they talked about needing from a coach. We also looked at other ways that these managers received the proper training or proper advice about how to be effective. But I was really zeroing in on coaching, and that's the results here. I mentioned this book is available. I have plenty of copies. It's in pre-release. It will be available eventually in an electronic version as well as on Amazon and other places. But there's a book for each one of you that's out on the table, on CoachLogic's table. Currently, I'm involved in writing the next book. I'm about halfway through interviews with, again, global, mostly CEOs, but people in very high, important positions within global companies. And I'm looking at the way that global mindset, this focus that I'm so passionate about, how is it needing to change? And also, what particularly in the last year, even shorter period of time, there's been a rise of, we call it populism. Many people have said that term, populism, as a sort of catchphrase for the rise of nationalism, protectionism, and we're at the very beginning stage. This takes me back to, I believe we are on the edge of something very profound. We're only maybe 6 months into having heard very much about it, but I think it could potentially be every bit as tumultuous for global societies as 2008 was when I was at the conference board coaching conference, and I talked about, as one of the only speakers who brought it up, saying, we're on the edge of something that's going to have impact for us. Now, I'll talk to you a little bit about why. As coaches or choosing coaches, you need to look for people who are capable of understanding how much is maybe going to change. You see clashes, there's uncertainty, and again, as a global corporation, you need to be able to predict. That's how you do budgets. That's how you do forecasting about your resources. And we have an extraordinarily uncertain time. That's what I'm picking up in India, in Japan, in different places where I'm coaching. Again, this is global mindset. To me, I'm realizing that global mindset was more of a positive ideal, the way I used to view it over the last, say, 10 years that I've been promoting that. We need to be more comfortable with change. Yes. Up to now, I've seen a paradigm of a positive orientation towards diversity, towards inclusion, and that equaled success. And I don't think we have that, not necessarily anymore. We have a very different time that's approaching, not very predictable. So what will it look like? Brexit. Most persons did not predict that that would be voted in. Just as in our own country, we are having things occur that we did not predict. Whether you're for it or not is not the point. The point is there's a break with the past. And as coaches or persons using coaching, you need to think about what that means. You need to choose coaches who are capable of coaching people in a time of extraordinary uncertainty. And I believe, from being in the front line out there in the rest of the world, as well as here, that we are on the edge of something extraordinary, not necessarily all positive. But companies are not going to cease to exist. They're not going to stop being global. But they're going to have to get it together because it's different. This happens to be India. Nationalism and what comes with it, like protectionism, is on the rise. And we are marching towards, it hasn't happened yet, but all of us read the papers and listen to, not just here in America, but it's happening in the rest of the world. We are about to go into things that affect global companies. Now, an example of supply chain. I work with a CEO based in Shanghai. He has 135,000 employees under his domain. He has 40 factories around the world. This is a typical global large company. 40 factories. It's highly sophisticated in terms of which factories make which products. This is a global product. And those have been thought through in the past really well. And it's all like a finely tuned clock or something, or it works. And yet, if you start putting up trade barriers, it falls apart. Now, what's going to happen because of that? Less profit. It's not going to be easier, it's going to be more difficult. But that global supply chain that most of us have had in our global companies is potentially at risk. Now, again, how does that affect us as coaches or as persons hiring coaches? You need to have a coach who understands context. So my word to you is, think about coaches who understand context. Trade wars. We've all begun to hear. It just hasn't happened yet. But this is like the lull before the storm. There's a storm coming. If we're lucky, it won't go very far. We'll back off. But there's a chance that it will get triggered. And we're not, if we try to restrict in our country, America, if we try to restrict imports, do you really think that other countries will not try to do the same? And so you have a contraction of world trade, possible. Now, this is perhaps way beyond anything that you really care about, but let's bring it back to what you should care about, and that is find coaches who can cope with a changed reality. This is no longer just about helping managers have better management skills. You've got to use coaches who understand context. Again, this is a different, I happen to have gone for business school to Thunderbird, but this is their definition of global mindset. Now, if I think about global mindset, now, in a sense, it's almost more defensive, rather than this march over the last 50, 60 years towards a more inclusive environment, towards more international understanding, more valuing of diversity. Instead, if you're going to be in a global business these days, you need to understand the unique differences of India versus Germany versus Bangladesh. If you're doing business in different countries, probably we are on the beginning stages of many countries turning inwards. And if you want to do business there, you're going to have to think about how these countries and their populations are unique. Not that we're going towards some global society. It's different. As I mentioned, there's a book out there. Again, the takeaways. Think about to yourself, thinking of context being probably, if I can tell you one thing to leave with, it's think of coaches needing to have context. And that context is, yes, coaching has become a developed profession worldwide. It is successful. It is going to continue. But there's some differences now. And part of it is global mindset is differently important. And the third area for takeaway that I'd like to leave you with is disruption is with us, and it will continue, whether it's Uber or others similar. And global events, the fourth area. Global events are happening. We probably are on the edge of something quite major, but it won't be the last one. Our societies are speeding up. Change is speeding up. So when you think of coaching, it's highly valuable. It's been proven. But you need to begin to shift your thinking about who do you choose. Whether you're doing the choosing or if you're offering as a coach, think through what you need as skills for yourself. Well, thanks a lot for inviting me. And if there are any questions, I'll answer it, and then we have lunch. Yeah, Leyland.
You talked about this whole idea of uncertainty and ambiguity. Some people call it complexity, the added complexity. Do you believe that both the manager, the leader, needs to really experience a level of transformation and a coach needs to help coach that transformation? That is, them seeing themselves and their place and the world differently?
Yes, I would answer yes. I mean, it's like, are you going to be against apple pie? No. Yes, but I think the caveat or whatever is probably that it's more important than ever. It's just we're in such a changeable time. And if you're an old dog like me, you got to be capable of learning new tricks. And I suppose what keeps me interested in new tricks is that I'm on the front line. You know, I'm in these places where, at least as far as coaching is concerned, it's new. But so transformation, yes. I don't know. Yeah, there's somebody over here with 2 hands. Oh, okay.
Hi, Sharon. I want to agree with you on one thing and disagree with you
Okay.
on the other. I've been doing international development since the 70s, and one thing that I noticed is when I first began that work, there was this emphasis on the relativity of truth, and that you really looked at integrating yourself into another culture by respecting that other culture and that sort of thing. But over time, and I think this came from my work in Afghanistan and humanitarian relief in Rwanda, et cetera, is that there is this sort of core truth in which all things emanates, and it's this human rights. It's this sort of core, because in my work, we work with such corruption and lack of wisdom and all of that, that there is a sort of core thing that has to drive you. So yes, there's a relativity and respect for cultural differences, but I think in the end there's this sort of core sense of human rights, and that as a primary driver of the conversation. The other thing I want to agree with you on, and I'm so excited to hear this in this meeting, it's not all that I do, but I run a coaching system, and I'm in Washington, D.C., and the people that my coaches support work inside the State Department and the United States Agency for International Development, and it is like a war zone. It's really hard to underestimate the lack of morale, it's sense that is the LinkedIn guy still here? LinkedIn guy? Okay. So this is like if Microsoft bought you and Microsoft hated you and didn't believe anything about what you knew and didn't respect the science of the work that you were doing, and the work that you're doing is directly related to saving lives, and you knew that if that primary agenda prevails, that people will die. And so that is the sort of, you're talking about 2 really different consciousnesses that really are at war in our species. So I really am glad you brought that in, because our coaches are really, like, our coaches who lack resilience are paying a price for not being able to pivot really fast on the pain that they're now working with.
I'd like to maybe comment to you, although you didn't really ask me a question. But you know what it brings up for me is really the implied question: do I have a central core of values? I work in places, Middle East, for instance, where there are different values. Russia has very different values. These are places where there are effective organizations that are successful, and they have a different set of values. And as a coach, one way of looking at it is, if I'm coaching a CEO in a culture that has different values than mine, what do I do about that? And I have really, I guess, 2 things to say. One is that they have employed me to help them not just get better management skills, but I'm much more in depth than that. I usually spend a couple of years at least with people. Sometimes it's much longer. It's a very, for my particular coaching, it's more in depth. So we do have the opportunity to talk about values. I do actually bring up some of my values, but I talk about the values more in terms of consequence. So I have values that might be similar to yours, but I also have to be careful because they're not employing me to proselytize my Judeo-Christian ethic, let's say. And I have, so it's kind of it's a judgment call. And I need to think, if I've accepted the job, what have they asked me to do and who's paying? And if I don't want the job because I don't agree with the cultural values, maybe I shouldn't take the job. But I have a different attitude also. If you could step back, it sort of links with this. My longest term client, I was asked in 1989 by Jack Welch and GE to do this role. And it was about 1992 before I started here in coaching. But I've only ever done one-on-one individual coaching, not other stuff. And so let's say with GE, if they call up and they say, we have a CEO in charge of a bank in, for instance, Thailand, where I've worked with one of their banks, I don't get to say yes or no, the way I see it. I'm a resource, and it's more analogous to being a doctor in an emergency room in a hospital. If somebody comes in who you would never want as a friend, do you have a right to say no? No, you're a service provider. And that's really the way I see my role, is that I am a service provider, and my own particular values are kind of separate. I have a service that I can perform. I'm capable mostly of helping people become more effective. I have a target audience that's kind of narrow. That just happens to be me. But I don't get to say yes or no the way I see it if I'm signed up to be one of the GE very top management coaches or other companies like that. So it's kind of, I really, look, you and I probably have similar values, but there's a time and place for what I'm doing. And I'm not there, let's say if I'm USAID, I'm part of the United States government spending money to, in fact, by implication, promote American values broadly. That's not my role. That's not what they paid me for. What they paid me for was to help the CEO be more effective. And so I've got to be careful. So I guess my values come out in subtle ways when they can. That's a long, you see, it's lots of qualifications because this is a hornet's nest. and particularly because I work in lots of different cultures in different parts of the world. Yeah. Yeah, and anybody, look, I'm going to be here the next couple of days, so, if anybody has any questions that didn't get answered.
Can you just flip back to the slide about the qualities that you look for in coaches?
Oh, yeah. Well, look, in the book, it's all that stuff is in this book. But, wait. The ones that look for... This one?
Oh, yes, yes.
Yeah. There you go. But there's not just these charts, but all of this research, lots of charts, more than you like to see, are in this book. And there are plenty of copies. Anything else quick? I think we're going to lunch. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.